Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to help kick off the Chicago Humanities Festival, a very important festival for the city of Chicago and for the intellectual and cultural life of the city. A few months ago, I was asked to speak at a conference in Rome, and the general theme of the conference was fear. And so I thought a bit about, well, what should I really try to speak about? And I developed a theme, that a link between fear and new technologies and the continual interaction between the solution or mitigation of different fears and the creation of new fears. And that seemed to me to be an appropriate theme today, particularly in light of the great financial fears that the world is now facing. So I'll develop that theme and give various applications, not only to the financial markets, because I think it's a general theme, and then of course I'll spend some time on financial markets and tell you what I think about what's going on. Well, I should say at the moment that nobody knows exactly what's going on. So if you think about the fears that in the world, fear of cancer, global warming, terrorism, the effects of globalization, financial crisis, of course, they're numerous and substantial. You look at some, here I compiled one survey on the fears about individuals, about the next generation. Will the next generation live in a safer world than we're living in? You can see there's a pretty big distribution of responses to this. Some people think it's a lot safer. That's a small fraction of the population interviewed. Some people think it'll be a little safer. About the same. You know, whenever you ask any question, the typical answer is, well, things aren't going to change very much. So about the same. Not surprising you find that. But it's the two right-hand side columns that I think are particularly interesting. There's a sizable fraction, roughly half of the population interviewed, who think the next generation is going to live in a less safe world. So fear, that's evidence of fear. Fear of safety in some general sense is pervasive, common. Now, fears were also common in the past. I remember in the 50s, the Cold War and the fear of nuclear attack, the concern about getting bomb shelters, and individuals were building bomb shelters in their own houses, and there was pros and cons of whether that was a good idea or not. So the enormous fear about the Cold War, the fear of polio. I remember growing up as a boy, every summer, the fear of polio, getting polio. Nobody knew what the cause was, and so people were doing all kinds of things to avoid what they thought were activities that would raise the chances of getting polio, not going swimming. Somehow there was a belief that it was communicated through swimming, staying away from people. And there was tremendous fear among younger people. Going back in time a little bit, child deaths. Up until the 20th century, great fear of parents was the death of the child in early childhood and death of the mother during childbirth. And of course, starvation, a universal fear of the world until really the middle of the 19th century when we began to control that fear. So I don't know if overall fears have been constant over time. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question. But there has been a resolution of certain fears, some of the fears I mentioned, historical fears, but a creation of new fears. And that's the theme of what I'm going to try to be speaking about and trying to answer why that has happened. Is it just an accident? Or is there something intrinsic that leads, I'm not going to claim there's a natural law of constancy, of fear in the world. I don't think so. But there's a relative stability in fears that's surprising in light of the enormous progress that has been made in many dimensions. And what's my thesis? It's a very simple one. It's that old fears have been solved, or at least resolved, reduced by the developments of innovations and new technologies. But unintended, I'll use the popular phrase sometimes, the unintended consequences of these technologies and innovations has been the creation of other fears. So that's the theme. In the process of solving some fears, we've created other fears. Now, I'll illustrate that thesis with various examples, including, at the end, a more extended discussion of the present financial and continuing financial crisis. And let me say it, I'm going to leave time at the end, so we'll have some Q&A. I really prefer Q&A to giving lectures, but you don't get Q&A unless you warm up the audience with a lecture. So I'll warm you up a little bit, I hope. And then I'm sure we'll get questions from this audience. So I have 4 or 5 examples. I start out with a medical one, clearly a very important and crucial one. If you look at the beginning of the 20th century, that's only a little over 100 years ago, child deaths were pervasive in the world. Even in the United States, they were pretty common. And people worried greatly when they had birth. As I mentioned earlier, they worried about the health of the mother, whether she would survive the birth. That was a very risky activity, and many women did not survive it. And they worried, in addition, about whether the child would be born alive or would survive the first 5 or 10 years. And death rates in most of the world were about half the children born didn't survive beyond 5 years. We worried about tuberculosis, other infectious diseases of childhood and adulthood. The major achievement, I like to say the major achievement, certainly a major achievement of the 20th century, was the conquering of a lot of these medical problems. For most of the world, child deaths are no longer a problem. And in every part of the world, there's been significant improvement, although in some parts, they're still much larger than one would like. But every part of the world has been enormous improvement. And in the developed world, and I interpret the developed world for this purpose as very broadly, child deaths are a very uncommon exception. They happen, but they're rare. So we've conquered that problem to a large extent. We've conquered a lot of the diseases of young adulthood. And demographers like to say that certainly for the advanced countries, the basic life expectancy pattern are kind of what we call rectangular. That very, very few people die before the age of 55 or 60. You look at life tables for the United States, it's just a fact that very few people die before the age of 60. Some people do, unfortunately, but very few do. And then death rates begin to increase. And ultimately, they increase very rapidly, although we have continued to push back substantially the age at which these rapid increases take on. So we've had those great achievements. And nevertheless, if you look at people in the world today, in the U.S. today, in the advanced world today, there's still enormous fear, medical and health fears. We've shifted the technologies we've created that enable people to live to old age have shifted the fears to diseases of old age. People didn't worry much. And in the poorer parts of the world, they still do not worry much about the fears of old age because hardly anybody reaches old age. But now we have all the fears of old age. We have breast cancer and prostate cancer and Alzheimer's disease and diabetes, and one can go on with a number of fracturing various bones and hip replacements and so on, a variety of diseases and illnesses and medical problems that are entirely the result of the medical developments of the 20th century, that we now have an increasing fraction of the population who can reach the ages where these diseases are prominent. We're making great progress in conquering these diseases. So take prostate and breast cancer. We haven't solved these diseases yet. The progress is in creating these from immediately life-eliminating diseases into chronic diseases. And that's how I understand is the way the oncologists who are working in the advanced areas in these two areas are thinking about it. Not necessarily getting an overnight cure for them that will be able to eliminate them. That will be a great hope. But before we get that way, converting them into chronic diseases. That's the advance of technology. So here in medical technology, we resolved a lot of the fears we had in the past. We've increased the fraction of people living longer, and people at old age have these fears that of a variety of diseases that afflict people of old age. It's a great achievement. As I say, I think it was the greatest achievement of the 20th century to do that. But whether it's reduced overall fears of people in the medical area is far less clear to me. Alzheimer's, not much progress made about Alzheimer's, less than I would say on prostate or breast cancer or some of the other cancers. But we will be making progress. Anybody who knows the history of technological advance and medical advance knows that we will be making significant progress in, if not conquering, in moderating greatly the onset and consequences of Alzheimer's diseases. Maybe after that we'll have some further diseases of people who have lived for over a century, new diseases and new problems that will arise. So that's great progress. But in a sense, it's left relatively constant, the fears of people, at the same time, I think, increasing the welfare of individuals. So you don't want to identify fear and happiness or welfare. They overlap, but they're in large measure separate concepts. Global warming. Now, global warming is a considerable problem as the world moves ahead. Differences of opinion about when the onset, the magnitude of the onset, a lot of uncertainty, but nevertheless, everybody appreciates that global warming is already on us to some extent, and a very high probability it will continue to get worse. And the difference of opinion is how worse and how rapidly will it get worse. But global warming, to the extent it has been man-made, and I agree, I accept the scientific evidence that at least a significant component of it has been man-made. Global warming has been largely the result of important progress, namely industrialization, economic progress that has greatly improved the living conditions of the average person in the world. So if you ask the question, how much real poverty in the world is there defined by people who have to live under $2 a day of income or $1 a day of income, a more tougher standard, that fraction has gone down enormously in the last 40 or 50 years, enormously. Just look at China alone or India alone. Hundreds of millions of people have moved beyond that level of poverty. Now, there are still people living in real poverty, at least as we Americans think of poverty. I mean, the poverty we have in the United States is really not poverty defined by the $1 or $2 a day standard. It's a much more relative poverty relative to the average standard of living in the country. Very few Americans have faced the issue of starvation, very poor medical attention, and so on. And the world has experienced enormous progress in that dimension. That progress has been due to economic progress. Nothing other than that. If you look at China, China did very little economically until the end of the 1970s, where it began to introduce various reforms, basically market-oriented reforms, and all of a sudden China in the last 25 years or more has experienced enormous economic growth that has taken, as I said, literally hundreds of millions out of poverty. Same for India, starting later around 1991 with the reforms of Dr. Singh, who is now Prime Minister, then Finance Minister, and I would say hundreds of millions of Indians have been taken out of real poverty. And you can see that in many other parts of the world. Not all, but many other parts of the world. So economic progress, I'd say industrialization, modern technologies, have had enormous effect on poverty in the world. That's real progress. But an unintended consequence of that has been the global warming issue. Okay? Nobody anticipated that in the industrialization period. The understanding of global warming is relatively recent, and the role of industrialization and contribution to it is relatively recent. And there's still a lot of not full understanding of how cloud cover and a lot of other technical issues that I don't really fully understand, certainly myself, affect the growth of CO2 in the atmosphere and its effect on the Earth. But there's no question one of the unintended consequences has been global warming. Now, I believe that will also be resolved and, if I believe, solved eventually with new technologies. People are working seriously now on battery-driven cars, so gasoline consumption is a major contributor to CO2 emissions in the world. If we can get a cheap, all-battery-driven car, we will greatly reduce the contribution of automobile use to CO2 emissions and to global warming. Carbon sequestration methods, active activity devoted to trying to develop such methods. Carbon extraction methods, even more, a bigger solution, that is extracting CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it in oceans and rocks and plants and a variety of other places. Now, these are not yet upon us, but again, the knowledge of how technology operates, the activity devoted to that, indeed the financial and other success for those people who come up with these solutions, I think guarantees that at some point we're going to achieve these goals. Now, the uncertainty is how fast and what do we do in the interim, and there you get into issues of carbon taxes and the like. But technology created this problem. I think it's going to solve the problem the way technology has created problems in the health area and has solved many of them, creates other problems and continues to solve. So it's a action-reaction sequence that goes on with technologies. And I think you see that not only in both the two areas that I mentioned. Another area would be globalization. Globalization has brought with it a great reduction in world poverty and in disease. I have a paper published 2 or 3 years ago, a couple co-authors, where we look at life expectancy in poorer countries relative to richer countries. And what we see, and very clearly, is there's been a great improvement in life expectancy in poorer countries compared to richer countries overall in the last 40 years. Now, not every single poorer country. The AIDS epidemic in some countries has pushed them backwards. But overall, it's a very powerful relationship, a convergence in life expectancy across countries. And we show further than that a lot of it is due to the spread of technologies that were developed in the rich countries to the poorer countries. Simple things, what we think of simple things as antibiotics, controlling infectious diseases, basic health care, clean water, and things of that type. Knowledge that was developed in the richer countries. Indeed, we find that countries that have been more tuned in to the global economy have been made greater progress in the medical area as well as in other areas. So they've been better able to import the relevant technologies from the richer countries. Now notice and this is related to my earlier point, that in these poorer countries, the technologies they're introducing are medical advances are those that are relevant in childhood and early adulthood. In fact, they've fallen behind, as far as we can measure it, in their command over diseases of older ages. That is, the gap between life expectancy at older ages is actually widened between the poorer and richer countries. Where they've made enormous advances is in those areas that are most relevant to the poorer countries, namely the diseases of childhood and early adulthood, where they have really high death rates. So that's what you would expect, and that's exactly what has happened. But those countries that have participated more in the global economy have been those who have been able to make the greatest successes. But the reduction in these sort of and other fears have led to other fears. The fear of unemployment due to foreign competition, financial contagion, as in the 1997-1998 Asian crisis, and to some extent in the present crisis. And I'll come back to the financial crisis later on. How do you overcome these unintended consequences of globalization? Well, one is more flexibility in your economy, so employment can adapt more readily. When you're in a global economy where the supply and demand for different types of industrial goods and services and different types of workers can be affected by imports from elsewhere, you need flexibility in the economy. And countries have discovered that greater flexibility enables them to adapt more. That's an innovation. I would say it's an innovation that came out of economics, modern economics, and it's an innovation that has served some countries very well in adjusting to globalization. Education. The title of my talk was Fear, Technology, and Education. And university education, college education, has helped individuals and groups of individuals protect against the fears of globalization, and indeed other fears. So I want to spend a little time on that issue. We're here at the University of Chicago, so if I didn't say something about the great advantages of higher education, Bob Zimmer would be on my back. I mean, this is what the University of Chicago and other universities stand for. But it is very important. The economic benefits of education and the other benefits of higher education have risen all over the world as globalization has increased and as countries have developed. You can see that both in the strictly economic side, in terms of earnings and unemployment. I'll show you some statistics about that, and in how different people have adapted to different shocks in health. I won't show you any data on health just to save some time, but let me assure you that also shows up in how people handle health and in many other areas that we have statistics about. Indeed, I make the claim there's probably no important aspect of life where people with higher education on the average do not do better than other people. The stability of marriage, you find that. Health, you find that. So I make the challenge to people. Give me an important aspect of life. We're on the average. I'm not saying every higher educated person is better than people with less education in every aspect of life. We know that's obviously true. It's probably true that Bill Gates makes more income than I do, and I have more education than he does. So we know there are plenty of exceptions, to individual exceptions to that rule. But public policy deals not with individuals, but with how groups are affected. And if you look at the group, there's no question it's true. And let me give you a few statistics. Here's for the United States. Very dramatic picture. It shows the earnings gap, hourly earnings gap between persons with a college education, college graduates, and persons who have with some postgraduate education, compared to those with a secondary school graduates, and shows what we call a time series. It changes over time. The purple is for the college graduates. The yellow line, the curve, is for the people with like MAs and PhDs and MDs and law degrees and MBAs and the like. And you can see that, if anything, there was a decline in the 70s. Prior to that, it was pretty stable at like 50% more, went down to about 35% advantage for college graduates, and there was a lot of discussion in the 70s of the overeducated American. We're still hearing some of these discussions. Charles Murray just came out with a book about the overeducated American. I think this chart will show he's way off the mark in his assertion. But what happened after the 70s? Well, anybody who wrote a book about the overeducated American in the 70s, and there were a few, would be very embarrassed, because after the 70s, there was an enormous expansion in the advantages, earnings advantages of higher education, both for people with a college degree. It went from a little over 1.3 to 1.7. That's a huge increase in a 30-year period. And for people with postgraduate, it went out from 1.5 to over 2.1, even a greater increase. These are the largest increases on record. I mean, now that may be because we don't have records going before the beginning of the 20th century, very good records going before the beginning of the 20th century. You might say this is unique to the United States, but it's not. I have some limited data here, data for a bunch of European countries. Same measure. A little bit different breakdown of the data, because we're looking again at the advantage of university education over secondary school education, but now we do it for two different cohorts. Those looking at them in the 80s. So for Austria, the advantage was like 55%. Then looking at them in the 90s, Austria was one of the few countries in the world where it was actually a decline. For almost all of them in Europe that we put down here, and there's a representative group of European countries, you find significant increases, both of those born in 1940 and in the 40s and those born in the 50s. You see that for Europe as well, dramatically. Here's some very rough data, because we only have rough data for China. A very huge increase for China from the 80s, when there was almost no advantage to having a higher education because of you didn't have markets, so everybody got paid the same amount, and as a result, nobody worked very hard in China in those days. Having visited China in '81, I can testify to that. I went to a number of factories and so on, and the fact was nobody was working very hard, and the productivity was very low, and didn't pay to have an education. By 2000, already there's an enormous improvement, and I don't have good recent data, but all the evidence suggests that's improved greatly. The applications from Chinese to go to universities in China and elsewhere has just exploded at as rapid a rate as one can imagine. I have some further data. Here's some data for Mexico. You can see about the time of NAFTA, there was an increase in the expansion of the returns for people with tertiary education. That means people with higher education in Mexico as well. And you can look at most other Latin American countries, you'll find similar developments. I wouldn't say it's happened in every country. There are some exceptions to this, but pretty much all over the world, developing as well as developed countries. A great advantage of education. I think it's in large measure to handle the greater risk that one is facing, the opportunities to take advantage of those risks with higher education. Here I show another risk. People sometimes say, well, if you have a higher education, there's a lot of unemployment of the more educated people. And there's no question that currently people who are working on Wall Street have increased their unemployment rates by a lot. Some people say they deserve it because they were making so much income. I wouldn't join into that statement. But here we have it on the average. Again, averages by different degrees of education for 2007. And what you can see is what we know very strongly. That's the low-educated people who suffer the fears and risk of unemployment far more than anybody else. It's a complete myth that highly educated people are the ones who face the risk of unemployment more than others. So low-educated people face that risk. They face it all the time, pretty much, and it's a really pervasive risk that they're facing. And you see how dramatic the effects are, especially when you come to people with less than a high school, who didn't finish high school, but it also shows up for high school graduates compared to those even with associate degrees. And you look down with professional and doctoral degrees, very, very low rates of unemployment. Again, not unique to the United States, but a very common pattern. Now here I have an interesting, my last slide on this area is, you're probably all familiar with the evidence that after the collapse of communism, between the 80s and the 90s is what I'm looking at here, there was a decline in life expectancy among Russian men. So here, the bottom set of charts shows Russian men and women, and you can see that there, on the average, there was a 2.5 decline in life expectancy between the 80s and the 90s. That was a huge increase in an environment where life expectancy all over the world was increasing significantly. Russian men, until recent years, in the end of the 90s and the early part of this century, had a life expectancy of less than 60 years. It was a terrible experience. And a good part of that was a change from the disorientation brought temporarily, I think, but a significant disorientation brought by a collapse of one economic and social system and the creation of another one. Now, what's interesting about this chart is that doesn't hold for people with university education. Their life expectancy continued to increase during this disoriented period. They were able to handle that type of risk, those fears, much greater. And to show that it isn't unique to Russia, I have some data here for Estonia. And the same thing, and pretty much exactly the same patterns hold for Estonia as hold for Russia. Okay? So I don't know if it held for every single communist country that collapsed. I haven't seen the data. But this was a study published in a Journal of Epidemiological Community Health, and where the evidence is extremely dramatic. My next to last example, and I want to move along a little more quickly now because, as I said, I would have time for questions, has to do with terrorism. Now, the goal of terrorists is to create fear. I mean, that's what terrorism is, to create fear. And when they succeed, they do create a lot of fear. And terrorists use technologies developed for other purposes. So here again, you see the role of technologies, useful in some areas, but serving other things that create fear. Remote explosives, suicide vests, cell phone communications, a variety of other technologies that in some of them terrorists are really experts on. Now, other technologies developed by the security and police try to fight the terrorists, screening at airports, listening in on cell phone conversations, guided missiles to destroy homes. You know, a lot of unpleasant activities that countries engage in order to try to reduce the incidence and likelihood of terrorism. Okay? I have one slide that shows the fear engendered by terrorism, and again, the role of education in evaluating those fears better, and therefore reducing the fears. This is the effect. This is a study I'm engaged in with another economist on the effect of suicide bombing attacks on buses and in other ways in Israel, where you've had a lot of, in the last couple of decades, a lot of terrorist attacks. So it's for economists, it's a good place to get data. And you can see what we look at in this table is what happens when there's a suicide attack on a bus to people's use of buses. 3 days afterwards, there's about an 8% decline in bus use as a result of one suicide attack on a bus. Okay? These are all lines. It's not just the lines where the attack occurred, all lines. Not much difference by education. 7 days afterwards, for high school graduates and above and below, it's even a larger effect, 10% decline. But for college graduates, it's virtually gone to zero. College graduates were able to absorb correctly that this is really a pretty small risk, and therefore they resumed. 10 days later, Then you see high school graduates beginning to respond significantly, so there's only like a 5% decline, and college graduates it's still 0. So the response overall is pretty quick, but it's especially quick for college graduates. And we have other data where you see exactly the same thing. If you look, for example, at the mad cow disease scare in Europe, in fact, it had a very low probability of having any incidence. Meat consumption declined by about 40% in European countries, beef consumption, much less among college graduates than among other people. They analyzed, absorbed the information, which was correct, that this was a low probability event, and they were able to control their fear and panic, so to speak, as a result of that. Now, my last example comes to the financial crisis. I don't need to tell everybody here about the great fear being generated by this crisis. And fortunately, we have evidence, quantitative evidence, on the fear of individuals. Here's a 3-month Treasury bill. This is considered the safest form of asset that one can hold. And you can see how the rate on this asset collapsed in the last I forgot what's the last few, month or so, for a period of time was actually negative. That is, people were putting like $1 million into a 3-month Treasury bill in the expectation they would get back like $990,000 afterwards. I mean, worse than holding cash. I mean, they had all this money. They were willing to take negative returns. That was for a more prolonged period in Japan, but it happened in the United States, but not for a long period of time. But they were now taking a very low interest rate on it. They were, why are they taking this interest rate? Because of the great fear. They were retreating away from risk. Fear and risk are very much related, and in the financial markets, you have quantitative measures. Here's what's called the LIBOR rate. It's the interbank lending rate, short-term lending rate. There's an overnight lending rate in Europe, and you can see it goes along at 2%. It's one of the least risky forms of activity because you get paid the next day. Shot up to over 6% for a while, came back, shot up to over 6% for a while, came back a little, is now around 5% or so. So a tremendous increase in fear. What's the source of the problem? Well, I can only give you a few general things that I believe are the major source. One is partly technology. That is, there was a great development of important financial instruments, derivatives, securitization, credit swaps, that were important, whose goal was to help companies, pension funds, manage risk. And they did do that for a while, and did it quite well. The downside of it that economists did not sufficiently understand, including the most advanced financial economists, is that there was a certain degree of aggregate risk for the system as a whole in responding to shocks that were increased rather than decreased. So that's one important factor. A second factor, which is interesting, is there are a lot of statements being written that because of the increased knowledge of how central banks should operate, inflation control, Taylor rules, and a variety of other techniques, we knew how to stabilize the world economic system. And indeed, if you look at the fluctuations in the world economy, in the U.S. economy in particular, since 1970, they were much more moderate than they had been previously. Much more moderate. So there was a belief that we knew what to do now. And I think we did learn a lot. Unfortunately, the combination of the aggregate risk created by these new financial instruments, the high leverage that was taken in hedge funds, investment banks, and so on, based on the feeling that they could manage risk much better, I think had a certain fragility to it when there was a loss of confidence in the system as a whole. I think that's what's going on in this panic. right? So it's technology in part that's creating it. Of course, the United States has had panics in the past. The world has had panics in the past. There's a global panic because of the interdependence of the different financial systems. And the unintended consequence, again, it's an unintended consequence. Great innovation. I'm a big supporter of derivatives and securitization and so on. It's an important financial innovation. But I don't think we fully understood some of the consequences of this innovation. And we're seeing them now. Now, what can we do about it? Do we have the techniques available to solve the problem? I think you have to think of short and long term, and I've written some about that. I just published a piece in the Wall Street Journal last Tuesday, giving my thoughts on it. A number of other economists publishing pieces. Volcker, the former very eminent chairman of the Federal Reserve, published a piece this week also in the Wall Street Journal. I think in the short run, we're doing the right things. We're trying to create liquidity in the banking system, indeed in the system as a whole. So the Federal Reserve is now willing to lend to non-banks, to companies. That's unprecedented. It's willing to and is lending to investment banks, which it didn't do in the past. So it's trying to create much greater liquidity and to some extent maybe increase capital. I think that's the right thing to do. I think ultimately it's going to solve this problem. I don't think it's going to solve it without the U.S. economy getting into a recession. I don't think we'll get into a major recession. I certainly don't think we're in the Great Depression. Some people have said, well, this is the greatest financial panic since the Great Depression. It is, but the Great Depression had 25% unemployment for a decade, had declines in output for 20 to 25% for a while. I would be almost certain that we're not going to get anywhere near that during the current crisis. We will get declines in output. We will get a recession, I believe. I mean, I'm saying it with great confidence. Let me add, I believe in all that. We will get maybe a serious recession, but we're not going to have the Great Depression. I think that's technology. We know more. We're not going to do some of the major mistakes that were done at that time. In the longer run, I think we have to try to cut the leverage through higher capital requirements. That was one mistake we made with investment banks and hedge funds. We have to close down Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac. They certainly contributed in a major way to the loose standards in the housing market. They were private companies, but with government creation and with government implicit insurance, and now they're taken over by the government. I think we have to get them out of the market as quickly as possible. So it's a major panic, much more important than I thought 9 months ago. But I think we will overcome it by the tools that we have available now, and tools that we, again, it's innovation and technology, things we understand a lot better, I will make this assertion, than we understood at the time of the Great Depression, where what the Fed did was contribute to the collapse of the banking system, allowing the money supply to decline by 25%, an enormous decline, and other developments to occur. And I think the Fed understands they have to move very differently now. They are doing it. And while so far it hasn't shown up in dramatic recovery, I think it will. So let me conclude and have a little time at least for questions. There are many fears throughout history. They've changed over time as technology and innovations have reduced old fears, but they've had unintended consequences of creating new ones, like disease of old age. As people live longer, that's great. People live longer, but the fear is still there and pretty pervasive. Financial crises multiply economic fears, but there are short and long-run steps to take that can reduce that. I've mentioned some of those. And although new fears have replaced old fears, I think human welfare has increased greatly over time. There's data on happiness. I think if you look at the data on happiness accurately, as done in some recent studies, you do find that wealthier countries have greater happiness than poorer countries in the world, as well as richer people in the country have greater happiness than poorer people in the country. So I think happiness has increased greatly over time. We don't have long-term measures of that, mainly because the fundamental fears of men and women and children throughout history, until the 19th century, of early death, starvation, horrible existences, for most of the world that's been ended. And to me, that's a great accomplishment of technologies. Unfortunately, as we've accomplished that, these technologies have led to other fears, but my optimistic conclusion is that we will conquer these other fears as well. Thank you very much.